Hello, welcome to this month's episode of Vox Oceanis. This month we will be talking about the voyage of the Russian Second Pacific Squadron to the Far East from the Baltic Sea during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. At the start of the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Pacific Squadron was based out of Port Arthur in what is today Manchuria, China. Now, initially, things did not go well for the Russians. They suffered several setbacks, leading eventually to the Tsar, Nicholas II, and various advisors to decide on a course of action to be followed that required the sending of a significant portion of the Baltic Fleet to reinforce the Pacific Squadron so that, in combination, Russian forces would be able to wrest control of the sea from the Japanese Navy and change the course of the war. The man that they decided on to lead this voyage was Rear Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhensky. Now, Russia had arguably better admirals. However, they had already been sent to the theater of war. Their most able admiral, a man by the name of Makarov, had unfortunately been lost along with his flagship due to Japanese mines. So the best admirals had already been sent. Having said that, Rozhensky was still a formidable admiral. He had a lot of experience, and he knew what he was doing when it came to commanding sailors. One of the things that he was particularly well known for, apparently, was his temper. He had a habit of tossing pairs of binoculars overboard that he was holding when he would fly into his rage, and he was also not above physical punishment, so he was definitely a harsh leader, but a strong leader. So, given the choices available, he was almost certainly the best option. The Second Pacific Squadron, which Rozhensky was integral in forming, initially was formed out of the most modern units available in the Baltic Fleet. These included the four just completed battleships of the Borodino class, the Knyaz Suvorov, which was to serve as Rozhensky's flagship, the Orel, the Borodino, and the Alexander III. In addition, there was another battleship which had been on its way to the Far East when war broke out in January of 1904, but was recalled because of the limited size of the force. It would not have been able to break through the Japanese Navy, called the Oslaba. These five battleships made up the center, the core of the fleet. In addition, several old armored cruisers were included as well, along with transports carrying supplies, and at least one hospital ship named the Orel, just like the battleship that was also along as well. However, these ships were part of the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy, with the exception of the force at Port Arthur during this period, and even today still, is icebound for a significant portion of the year, so they don't have a lot of time to train at sea with maneuvers. Throwing on top of this the fact that a lot of the crew are conscripts, and these conscripts are peasants a lot of the times who probably haven't seen a warship or even the ocean before, and you have a system that is set up to give low quality crews to ships that, based on the reputations that they had, were not necessarily the best quality of ships. So, unfortunately for Rozhensky, he has a fleet that, while on paper looks really good, is poorly manned, and to make things even worse, while he is on his voyage, he has not been given enough ammunition so that he can practice gunnery on the way. So his fleet will not be able to practice gunnery on its voyage over to the Pacific theater. After doing his best to ensure that the older vessels of the Baltic Fleet are not added to his squadron, thereby slowing it down, Rozhetsky's force departs Kronstadt, the naval base at the entrance of St. Petersburg in the Gulf of Finland, on the 29th of August, 1904. Hopefully they're thinking on the way to relieve Port Arthur and meet up with the Russian forces there. However, Rozhetsky and a good number of other people in the cabinet as well believe that Port Arthur will fall before he is able to arrive in theater. Now, just a few days before this, on the 10th of August, or roundabout there, the Russian forces at Port Arthur actually attempted to break out of Port Arthur, go around the Korean Peninsula to Vladivostok. They were not successful in this, which resulted in the Battle of the Yellow Sea. They were forced to return back to Port Arthur, which ended up sealing their fate. Now, the initial port of call after the force left on the 29th of August was the then Russian town of Ravel, modern-day Tallinn in Estonia, and they stopped there waiting for a few more ships that had repairs still being done by the shipyards back near St. Petersburg. Now, as they are waiting, they're going to continue to get supplies from Russia itself, and Rozhetsky, because he knows that he has poor quality crews, is going to use this opportunity to try and practice maneuvers. Now, while they are in Ravel, they are going to be visited by the Tsar. The Tsar has the utmost confidence that his fleet will turn the tide and will do what needs to be done in order to ensure Russian success in the war. Unfortunately, after he toured the ships, the Tsar left. He ended up never seeing the squadron again. Now, the squadron stayed in Ravel until the 28th of September, so it stayed there quite a while. During that time, the Russians had been trying to figure out what the Japanese were doing, and to accomplish this and to secure the routes along which the squadron was likely to pass, the Russians set up a series of spy rings. Now, Russian intelligence service was fairly dysfunctional. They ended up having 5 separate spy rings operating at the same time, all reporting to different departments in the Russian government. The end result of this is that the Russian government was in a position to hear many interesting tales from many interesting people in such varieties that they are maybe difficult to truly accept. Now, the result of this was basically that the Russians were getting reports that the Japanese were preparing to strike the Baltic Fleet, or at this point the Second Pacific Squadron, while it was still in the Baltic. They were getting reports that there were Japanese torpedo boats, that there were plans of sabotage, and that the Japanese were getting ready to do this while still in the Baltic Sea. As a result, the Russian crews were a bit high-strung. Now, they managed to get from Ravel to Libava pretty uneventfully. After that, which Libava was the last Russian port that the squadron would set in to before reaching the Pacific, after leaving Libava, the Russian fleet continued on to pass through the Danish Straits, stopping for coal at Skagen, which is at the very northernmost tip of Denmark. Now, at this point, the Danes were very, very pro-Russian, and they were actively helping them, allowing the Russians to anchor in their waters, to take on coal, to do what they needed to do. In addition, they also were helping to protect the Russian fleet as they passed through Denmark's territorial waters. Now, going back to the spy rings, as the Russian fleet was nearing Denmark, became more active, more certain that they were seeing Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea, that there were Japanese forces ready to ambush them. And in fact, on the 7th of October, while they were coaling in Skagen, Rozevsky received a report stating exactly that there were Japanese torpedo boats spotted nearby, and that things were looking very dangerous. Now, it's important to remember, the way that the Russo-Japanese War had started was with a Japanese torpedo attack on the anchored Russian fleet at Port Arthur, causing some significant damage. Because of this information, Rozevsky immediately stopped coaling and set sail, looking to avoid an attack by these forces. Now, it is important to note that logistically, such an action was physically impossible for the Japanese to pull off. During this entire voyage, the closest Japanese forces were in Asia, based out of Japan. So every time that the Russians are afraid that there's a Japanese force nearby, that is paranoia possibly fed on by the Japanese, adding fuel to the flames, but it is Russian paranoia. So that is an important thing to remember during this entire voyage. Now, after leaving Skagen, the Russian fleet sails to continue on its voyage. Now, heading out of Skagen, the Russians are presented with a choice. They can either go to the north of England, which is probably the safer option, or they can try a shortcut and go through the English Channel. Another thing to remember is that during this period, Great Britain and Japan are allies. So, you have the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. Because of this, and the fact that Russia and England had been butting heads in the great game of empire since the 1880s at the least, possibly earlier. But because they'd been butting heads, there's great distrust between England and Russia. And because of this, you have a belief in the Russians that the English, because of their alliance with Japan, will actually directly help out the Japanese. There is some evidence that there was some diplomatic maneuvering, possibly, but there's no evidence that the Japanese and the British governments specifically colluded together in anything more meaningful than that. Now, sailing from Skagen on October the 8th at 8:45 p.m., one of the following non-combatant ships, a repair ship called the Kamchatka, started reporting an attack. Kamchatka was at the back of the formation. She was old and unreliable, and somehow, for some reason, she started to believe that she was under attack by torpedo boats. As a result, Rozevsky signaled his entire force to be ready for torpedo attack from the stern, because that was where the Kamchatka was. After sending out a variety of signals relating to the attack, ranging from being attacked from all directions to torpedo boats closer than a cable length, her last message was that she was heading east at 12 knots, back in the direction of Skagen. When inquired as to what was going on at 11:20 after having been ordered to turn back west, the Kamchatka's response was that they didn't see anything. About 1 in the morning, same night, as the fleet was continuing on, everybody convinced that there were torpedo boats nearby. Rozevsky, on the bridge of his flagship, saw dark shapes approaching. Now, while they were doing this, they were unlit, which looks very suspicious. Now, Rozevsky's reaction, in a position of a man thinking that he's under attack, is reasonable. His response, because he was assuming that these are torpedo boats, is to change course and to turn on spotlights. Now, apparently, Rozevsky, for the rest of his life, was certain about what he saw, and that was that he saw a torpedo boat, and he gave the order to open fire. However, the problem arose from the fact that, in all likelihood, what he saw was not a torpedo boat, but actually a fishing trawler. The firing, which he initiated, soon became indiscriminate. Eventually, before the firing ended, several Russian ships were hit with fire from other Russian ships, who were the only ones shooting. After gaining control, still fearful of a torpedo attack, the Russian force continues on without stopping. The result was that of the fishing boats that were taken under fire, one was sunk, several were damaged, several men killed, and at least 30 were injured. The result of this action was a war scare between England and Russia. Now, on the 13th of October, Rozensky and his battleship, the 5 modern ones, they put into the Spanish port of Vigo. The rest of his squadron, which continued on without stopping, arrived at the original rendezvous point of Tangiers in Morocco. When he arrived in Vigo, Rozensky sent off a cable to the Tsar telling him that he had arrived there, and during this time, the British, who were up in arms, were preparing for war. The British Mediterranean fleet was put on a heightened state of alert. The Russian forces were being shadowed by British cruisers, and there was a full expectation that England and Russia might very well go into war as a result of this incident. However, Tsar Nicholas II decided in the end that it was better for Russia to have peace with England at this point than to go to war. Eventually, the matter was put before an international tribunal for moderation. Rozensky was required to leave behind officers as witnesses, and as a result of this situation, he and his force were delayed for about 10 days or so. The force in Vigo was finally able to leave to rendezvous with the rest of the formation at Tangiers on the 19th of October. However, it wasn't until another 10 days after that, the 29th, that the squadron actually left Tangiers to continue on its way. That day, the British government finally considered the crisis past and war to not be likely. Now, leaving Tangiers, the Russian fleet split into 2 separate formations. One containing the largest and most recent battleships under Rozensky's command was to sail south around the Cape of Good Hope to Madagascar. The other, sailing under the command of Admiral Felkersam, was to sail through the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal and rendezvous with Rozensky's portion of the fleet in Madagascar at the port of Sainte Marie. The reason why the Russians split the squadron at that point officially was because the battleships, the newest ones, were too big to fit through the Suez Canal. This was not the case. The reason why was because the Russians feared British machinations, so they didn't want the British to trap them in the Suez Canal and render the fleet impotent. So the majority of the forces were to sail around the coast of Africa. The first port of call for Rozensky's portion of the fleet was at Dakar. Now, at Dakar, the French were initially quite welcoming. However, as a result of the Dogger Bank incident, the French did not want to press their luck with relations with the British, and in the process endanger their recently signed Entente Cordiale, which brought about good relations and would eventually be instrumental in bringing the British in on the side of the French and Russians during World War I. As a result, Paris ordered that the French squadron was to only stay in the port as long as was allowed under the rules of neutrality, which was only 24 hours, and that they could not take on coal in their colonies. However, the French and the Russians were allies, so the French had originally been planning to allow Rozensky and his forces to coal and to resupply in the French colonies along the way to their destination. However, the French governor, upon informing the Russian admirals this, made sure to point out that his orders were to tell him to leave, and through some mutual understanding, it was basically pointed out that the French had no shore batteries at Dakar, and as a result, the Russians could not be forced to leave. So the Russians stayed in Dakar, finished their coaling, and then continued on. Their next stop was at Libreville along the coast. On the way to Libreville, the navigators of the fleet ended up getting them lost. So Rozensky ended up sending one of his auxiliary ships to locate the mouth of the Gabon River, which Libreville was built on. Now, eventually, on the 13th of November, the auxiliary ship named Rus did find the Gabon River, and Rozensky brought his ship to that location. Now, there, it took him a little while because of a lack of communication, but he was able to get an update on what was happening in Manchuria during this period that he had been at sea. And the news was not looking good. The army had not been able to relieve Port Arthur and did not seem to be in a position to make any further attempts to do so in the near future. This did not bode well for Rozensky's primary mission, which was to regroup with the Port Arthur squadron. On the 19th, the squadron left Libreville, headed south. Just 40 miles south of Libreville was the equator, which resulted in a series of festivities to celebrate the crossing of the equator. However, it must also be noted that they were at the equator, and these are Russians. The heat was quite troublesome for the Russian sailors, making life difficult not only for the enlisted men, but also for the officers as well. Now, it's important to note as well that Russia was incredibly classified in terms of social classes, and especially in the Navy, this was very apparent. And this would actually result in troubles for the Russians later on the next year in the Black Sea, but that's a story for another time. It is important to note, though, that even here this can cause trouble for Rozensky and his fleet with injustices and other things not lining up well. On the 23rd of November, the squadron reached Great Fish Bay. Now, Great Fish Bay was a property of Portugal, and as a result, there was a Portuguese gunboat there. However, Portugal was not particularly inclined to help the Russians, and the commander of the gunboat said that the Russians could only stay in accordance with the rules of neutrality, could not load coal, food, or water, and have to leave in 24 hours. However, Rozensky's response to this was that the bay was big enough and wide enough so that there's an area in the middle that was outside of the 3-mile limit imposed on national boundaries for local control of water. It was in this area that he was going to keep his fleet, which counts as the open sea, where he can anchor his fleet, coal, take on water, and food. Needless to say, this did not particularly please the Portuguese gunboat's commander, and acting in a manner that was not necessarily in his best interest, he decided to threaten to force the Russians to leave, which, if you think about it, is rather silly when you only have a gunboat versus at least 5 battleships and sundry other vessels. As a result of this, realizing the error that he made, he decided to withdraw and try and gain additional assistance to force the Russians out. Now, the Russians did not stay very long. They departed the next day on the 24th of November, and they continued on their way, arriving at a secluded spot in German West Africa called Angra Pequena on the 28th of November. There's really not much going for this location. The harbor itself was poorly protected. The Russians actually arrived there in the middle of a storm, and as a result of this storm, it was several hours before Rozensky could send a boat ashore to make contact with the authorities there. Having said that, the area was not particularly well inhabited. There were only 10 Germans in the entire settlement, and the settlement there was inland far enough that it could not be seen from the ships. The German commander was more accommodating than the French or the Portuguese had been. He was not a diplomat. He informed everybody that officially he had not received any information that the Russians were coming, that he could not see the ships from the window of his house, and that he had no cruiser at his disposal and could not be expected to patrol the coastline in a native dugout, and that there was a quote. Therefore, this German commander decided that Rozensky was basically free to do as he pleased. This is probably the warmest welcome that he had received since leaving Tangier. Now, Rozensky was doing his best to coal while he was in Angra Pequeña. However, weather wasn't being particularly kind or helpful in this matter, and as a result, they had to use smaller boats to take the coal from the coal ships to the ships that needed them, which added extra time and extra labor into the process of coaling. Now, on the 1st of December, the German port commander did visit the Suvorov, and this might very well have been the highlight of this particular German's life because of the quite extensive welcome that he received. Bands playing the German national anthem, plenty of alcohol was consumed. Either way, it was definitely something to be remembered. In addition, the German major also passed on additional reports of various goings-ons, suspicious vessels and the like, none of which helped to calm Russian nerves. In fact, if anything, they were designed to increase them. There were concerns about Japanese scouts or saboteurs being in the area. There were concerns and beliefs that the British had built a fleet of schooners for the Japanese in Bombay, which were all equipped with torpedoes. This idea is far-fetched and inaccurate. Did not happen, but it's important to understand that this is what Rozensky believed he was facing, so he had to be prepared for such an occurrence. While they were there, the squadron received a newspaper from Cape Town, from a passing ship. In it contained a report that Port Arthur was being bombarded by the Japanese from a position called Vysokia Hill. Rozensky, checking with one of his officers that had experience in Port Arthur, confirmed that with this being the case, the fortress was almost certainly going to fall quickly, as the hill overlooked the entire Russian positions and the harbor itself. This would in fact lead directly to the loss of the Port Arthur squadron in totality as a result of Japanese fire being observed and corrected onto the Russian ships, which were then quickly sunk at anchor in the harbor. On December 4th, the squadron left Angra Pequeña, bound for Saint Marie on Madagascar. On the way, they passed by several suspicious vessels, but none of them came particularly close and were not stopped and searched for war contraband. On the 6th of December, it was a special occasion, as that is St. Nicholas's Day, and for Russia, St. Nicholas is the patron saint of the Navy. While Rozensky apparently was not particularly religious, like many sailors, he was very superstitious, and he ordered a mass and a salvo, a salute, to celebrate the occasion. By this point, they were nearing the Cape of Good Hope, and were coming across some rather severe storms, as is common for that region of the world. The waves were massive, some as high as 40 feet. However, as is the case with a lot of storms in that area, while there were large waves, there was not much in the way of wind. As his ships were laboring up and down over these waves, it was definitely not a enjoyable condition for the Russian sailors. However, for Rozensky, there was one good thing to these storms. Vessels like the schooners that had been reported to him would not be able to sail, let alone attack, in such conditions. By the 9th, the storm reached its peak. The battleships were rolling side to side, screeching from the stress that the hull was being placed under. Apparently, the waves appeared to be running at the battleships almost vertically. However, one of the transports, named Malaya, had engine troubles and had to stop. However, gallantly struggling on, she tried to set up makeshift sails to continue on. However, the squadron could not stop, and it was assumed that the Malaya would be lost. Unfortunately, before reaching Madagascar, there would be no signals from the Malaya, despite the fact that after the storm stopped on the 10th of December, the Admiral Rozensky attempted to contact her. At the same time, though, the Kamchatka, which had caused trouble in the Dogger Bank incident, was once again causing trouble, starting to lag behind. Apparently she was having trouble with her coal and sent a signal requesting the permission to throw 150 tons of coal overboard. Rozensky's response was basically, no, the only thing that you can throw overboard are saboteurs. By the 16th of December, Rozensky's portion of the squadron reached Sainte Marie Island off the coast of Madagascar. However, upon arrival, despite the fact that they were supposed to meet with the force under Admiral Felkersam that was sent to the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, these forces were nowhere to be seen. Felkersam's squadron had left Tangier on the 21st of October. His force contained 2 older battleships and a few cruisers and a few torpedo boats as well. These forces sailed through the Mediterranean and arrived at Souda Bay on Crete on the 28th of October. Now, once they got there, Admiral Felkersam was less of a disciplinarian than Rozensky was, and he allowed his men to go ashore and let themselves have an outlet for the various things that they were feeling. A lot of men felt that the entire voyage was doomed. The results were unimaginative and a bit of an embarrassment for Russia, with many of the sailors getting drunk and then involved in quite substantial fights with the local population. While this caused a scandal for Russia, it was not anywhere near as disastrous as the Dogger Bank incident was. Felkersam's force remained at the island of Crete until at least the 1st of November. By the 11th of November, his force had reached Port Said on the northern end of the Suez Canal. The next morning, his ships weighed anchor and began passing through the canal, all the while watched by the British and the French. The next day, after entering the canal, they finally reached Suez on the Red Sea coast, and there they were greeted by a British ship, the Hermione. They exchanged salvos. However, there were no official calls paid, as Felkersam did not intend to spend a lot of time at Suez. In fact, he only intended to spend 15 hours there, leaving the very next morning. Despite concern about Japanese attacks in the Red Sea, which, being a narrow body of water, would be an ideal place for such an event to occur, no attacks happened, and Felkersam was able to safely reach Djibouti at the southern end of the Red Sea. Anchoring there, Felkersam was subject to the same treatment that Rozensky had to deal with on the western side of Africa, in that the French were not as accommodating as they had originally been thought to be. So while he was officially ordered to move elsewhere, the local government, at least, did not seem to object to Felkersam's ships coaling, and Felkersam decided to wait for the colliers to arrive. Once they did, he was going to coal and continue on. However, more trouble was ahead. On the 21st of November, it was communicated that Paris was no longer going to allow the squadron to enter the Bay of Diego Suarez on Madagascar. Instead, as a result of Japanese pressure, the French offered a small island on the northern section of Madagascar called Nosy Bay. Now, there really wasn't all that much to commend Nosy Bay, except for the fact that it was inconspicuous and out of the way. Well, Felkersam received this message on the 21st of November. Rozensky, who had been sent the same message while he was at Libreville on the 17th of November, missed this message and had not replied. Felkersam's response was very emphatic. He did not want to change the meeting place, since that was the agreed upon location, that was his orders, and in fact took a direct order from the Tsar to get him to finally acquiesce to the new orders to go to Nosy Bay instead. On the 15th of December, Felkersam arrived at Nosy Bay as ordered by the Tsar. As Felkersam and Rozensky were arriving off Madagascar, a third detachment was being sent from St. Petersburg to reinforce them. This detachment was led by a man who was looking for glory, a man by the name of Dobrotrovsk. This force had left from Libava on the 3rd of November, as Felkersam was traveling through the Mediterranean and Rozensky was coaling in Tangier. Along the way, he passed through Doggerbank, where the fishing ships seemed to be just as unconcerned as on any other day. So they were not particularly worried about the Russian warships passing by. However, his squadron developed a problem with fresh water, and so in order to fix this problem, before continuing on, he had to deal with the problem in the English Channel. Now, here he had two options. Either he could try to stop by Dover, fix the problem there, and then continue on, or he could try to do so in one of the French ports, most notably Brest. Here he did what might be the unexpected thing. He decided to stop by Dover to fix his problem, because there at least he knew that everybody was, and as far as the Russians were concerned, an enemy. So he stopped by Dover, fixed his problem, continued on, arriving in Tangiers in late November. On the 23rd of November, Dobrotrovsky left Tangier, sailing through the Mediterranean, following the route of Felkersam. Along the way, they had machinery trouble with some of their forces, slowing them down. One ship in particular had to stop by a Spanish port to effect repairs. Now, while that ship was enjoying the hospitality of Spain, getting these repairs done, the rest of the fleet continued on to Crete, where they anchored in the same spot as the Felkersam detachment, waiting for the Izumrud to return from its trip to Spain. Unfortunately for the crew of the Izumrud, on the way back, they ran into some fearful storms. So, in addition to the good time that they had, they also had a rather unpleasant one. Despite not wanting to linger too long, the Izumruds kept having engine troubles, delaying them further, and eventually even the main ship of the formation, a cruiser by the name of Oleg, also developed engine troubles. As a result, they required extra time to ship replacement parts out, slowing them down, lengthening the time spent at Crete. So instead of the 2 weeks that they spent there, they ended up spending almost 4, total 28 days on Crete. Finally, on the 26th of December, Dobrotrovsky's detachment left Crete. After 2 days of sailing, they reached Port Said, and after 18 hours in the port, they moved on through to the Suez Canal, where they took on more coal on the other side, continuing on to Djibouti. During this time period, Dobrotrovsky was receiving reports that the Japanese were in the Red Sea, in the Indian Ocean, ready to attack him and his forces, just as such reports had been passed on to Felkersam and to Rozensky as well. Again, once they reached Djibouti, the Russian ships were having machinery trouble again forcing them to wait for such repairs to be finished. By all accounts, for most of the men, it was a very idle existence at that location. There were lots of sharks in the area, so they were watched, but there really was not much to do. Finally, in late January, the force was able to continue on. After making a quick pit stop in Dar es Salaam, the force continued on, reaching Nosy Bay and the rest of the Second Pacific Squadron on the 1st of February. Meanwhile, Rozensky had been having a difficult time with the instructions coming in from St. Petersburg. It was only once he anchored at St. Marie and sent a cable informing the Tsar of his arrival there that he learned that the location where his squadron was to gather up had been changed without his knowledge from Diego Suarez to Nosy Bay. Now, once he arrived there, he found that despite the fact that all of his forces gathered there was still maintenance work that needed to be done, significantly so, on the ships. Finally, with the fall of Port Arthur at the end of December 1904, it was called into question what was to be done with the squadron. Rozensky, applying a accurate representation of what was going on to the situation, felt that it was in the best interest of Russia to recall the squadron. However, Tsar Nicholas II disagreed. He decided that the expedition was to continue on to gain mastery of the sea and to defeat the Japanese. In order to help accomplish this, Nicholas II decided to form a third squadron in the Pacific that was basically to be comprised of all of the old, slow, rejected ships that Rozensky had so vehemently opposed being added to the fleet. This squadron was to be put under the command of Admiral Nebogatov. It was expected to be departing late January from St. Petersburg and arriving somewhere in late February in Djibouti to rendezvous with Rozensky. Now, Rozensky had been put into a difficult position by this ordeal that his ships had been through already. His health was less than good, and one of the things that he requested, in addition to the recall of the squadron, was that if it was to continue, that somebody else should be put in charge. His preference, and he stated so, was that it would be the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Chukunkin. However, these requests were not heeded. With all these machinations going on, Rozensky increasingly felt that in order to actually be able to do anything worthwhile for the Russian war effort, he would actually have to disobey the Tsar. Finally, having resolved this, on the 3rd of March, Rozensky and his squadron up and left from Nosy Bay without informing the Admiralty or the Tsar where they were going to depart to. The destination was unknown. So, at the beginning of March, Rozensky's squadron simply disappeared. Ironically enough, because of the delay in terms of the amount of time that it took the cables to reach St. Petersburg, the Russian Tsar did not learn of Rozensky's departure from Rozensky himself, or he did send a telegram to the Tsar telling him that he had left, but not where he was going. He instead learned about it from the French, who learned of it first. Finally, on March the 26th, after having disappeared for the majority of the month, Rozensky's squadron sailed through the Strait of Malacca, past Singapore, in quite exceptional order. Continuing on up through towards Saigon, Rozensky made for Kanharam Bay, the spot where he was going to wait for Negabatov's detachment. However, prior to reaching there, about 60 miles. Instead of just waiting until they arrived at Canram Bay, Rozensky ordered for his squadron to take on coal and began figuring out how ready his ships were, what sort of readiness they were in. In all likelihood, Rozensky intended to push on past Canram Bay, bypassing the meeting with Nebogotov, bypassing orders from the Tsar, and rush straight to Vladivostok. Unfortunately, he received some devastating news. One of his ships, the Alexander III, had apparently been miscalculating the amount of coal that they had been taking on and were 400 tons short. As a result of this, his force would not be able to do so. So he returned to what had been the original plan, anchoring at Canram Bay and waiting for Negabaltov. Negabaltov, in the meantime, had been operating without any knowledge of where Rozensky was, except that he was crossing the Indian Ocean. Continuing along, waiting for orders, Negabaltov set up several points where his forces could be contacted while at sea by the Russian government. Unfortunately for him, he missed the first one, or rather the courier missed him. But luckily for the third one, he was able to get information from the consul in Singapore as to Rozensky's location and where to meet him. Continuing along, Negabaltov arrived on the 26th of April, finally rendezvousing with Rozensky's squadron, which had been in Canram Bay since the 31st of March. Finally, after organizing the formation, coaling the ships, and getting everything ready to go, on the 1st of May, the combined 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons left the coast of Indochina, continuing on to the north. Now, at this point, at any day, the Russians expected to run into the Japanese. While they were advancing towards the theater of war, Rozensky decided to try and shed as many of his attendant transports as he could. Those that were not needed were sent to Hong Kong as they passed by. He also sent out a large majority of his auxiliary cruisers to attack Japanese shipping and to look for war contraband being carried by neutral forces. Now, heading north, Rozensky had a couple of options for trying to find a way to Vladivostok. The longest and least likely to run into the Japanese would be to sail north around the entire coast of Japan and then sail through the strait north of Hokkaido and then back down to Vladivostok. Now, this one was rejected on the problems of fuel. The Russians simply did not have enough fuel to get their fleet all the way around that way and to Vladivostok without any trouble. Now, Negabaltov, who had suggested this option, had also suggested that the Russian battleships could be towed by the transports to save on coal. Needless to say, in an area where you expect to run into an enemy, this is not a good idea. So that option was ruled out. The next option was just a little bit to the south between Hokkaido and Honshu in the main islands of Japan. This one was also rejected because that was enemy territory that would be watched quite vigorously by Japanese forces on land, and the chances of being intercepted were quite high. The third option was through the Korea Strait. The Korea Strait is split into two sections by a series of islands in the middle called the Tsushima Islands. The section of the strait between the Tsushima Islands and the Japanese mainland is often referred to as Tsushima Strait. Rozensky decided to try and punch through there. At this location, he has the highest chance of running into the Japanese fleet, but at the same time, it also provides the shortest route between him and Vladivostok, which is his goal of reaching. Finally, after days of sailing, sending out ships at various points in time. On the night of May the 14th, the Japanese spot the Russian hospital ship, Orel, following the Russian Navy, the Russian fleet, in the night. Now, the reason why the hospital ship was sailing with its lights lit was because it was a neutral vessel, according to the Geneva Convention, and as such was required to sail with lights lit. At this point, the story transitions from one of the Voyage to the story of the Battle of Tsushima Straits. However, the Battle of Tsushima Straits is worthy of its own episode, and we'll receive one later on. This is going to wrap up our episode for this month of Vox Oceanus. If you enjoyed what you heard, you're more than welcome to subscribe. If you really enjoyed, you could also become a patron of this channel on Patreon. Thank you for listening. We hope that you join us again for next month's episode, which will be covering the Galloping Ghost of the Java Coast, the USS Houston. Thank you for listening.